They laughed when she unloaded the odd, heavy thing from the cart, laughed louder when she couldn't name half its parts in proper English, said it looked like an iron coffin with legs, said it smelled like coal smoke and desperation, said the only thing foreign about it was how wrong it was, and still she hauled it inside. No one helped. The men had already decided she wouldn't last the winter. Her husband had died in Kansas just after the wedding. A horse threw him onto a river rock crossing. The widow arrived weeks later anyway, barely speaking the language, stubborn as a badger. She had thick braids pinned into a crown, skin leathered from sun and sea wind, and calluses on her fingers that made the preacher's wife murmur something about a washerwoman pretending to homestead. Her name was Anya, no last name anyone could pronounce. She didn't flinch when they sneered at her accent or her strange clothes or the heavy iron stove she dragged in pieces into the half-finished cabin. She just worked, dug the post holes, stacked her own logs, sealed the cracks with wool she carded herself. She kept a scarf over her mouth most days, not for the cold, but because when she spoke, they laughed harder. And when the first frost came in late September, a bitter, dry snap that caught even the cattle off guard, they remembered her. Because smoke rose from her chimney, when most chimneys were dark. But that's getting ahead. Back in August, they'd called it foolish. The stove, the way she lined the cabin walls with odd white bricks, the way she dug down before she built up, shaping a shallow hollow into the earth, flattening it smooth with a trowel before laying down crushed rock and sand. Then the strange polished stones she'd hauled from town in secret, 3 at a time, hidden in sacks of grain. None of it looked right. "You're not building a cabin," said old Samuel Horn, watching from the road with a tobacco grin. "You're burying a damn oven." Anya said nothing. She lifted another bucket of rock dust, her back straight despite the blisters. Horn spat and left. Most settlers did the same, pausing long enough to gawk or scoff or warn her the wind would rip through her low-sunk walls like a knife. But she didn't argue. She didn't stop. She laid the rock floor carefully, every stone heated by the sun before setting it. She packed them into the clay with bare feet, and sometimes used the base of her kettle to smooth down the dirt around them. Then she covered them, at least half, with metal plates taken from scrap. One was curved. One bore writing in a language no one in the valley spoke. Her chimney pipe wasn't straight. It twisted like a stovepipe on a ship, and it vented sideways, not up. "That thing's gonna choke her out by first snow," someone muttered at the store. "She'll be dead or gone by November," replied another. But she kept working, and it got stranger, because one morning in early September, just before the frost, she brought the stove out, all in parts, big ones, dark iron legs that curled like roots, a firebox shaped more like a barrel, and inside it coils, heavy coils, black and greasy, looped like snakes. No one could say how she'd hauled it all from the general store, though storekeep Barlow said she paid in full, and carried it piece by piece in a wheelbarrow she patched with rope and branches. A child tried to sneak up to see the thing once, got a sharp word from her in a tongue no one understood, and ran off crying. After that, no one got close. The stove went in through the front door. The door was too small. She knocked out the frame. They heard the pounding all afternoon, watched the smoke rise as she soldered or fused, or did something none of them could explain. Black smoke, too dark for wood. It didn't smell like pine. It smelled like coal and brick and salt. Some said oil, some said worse. And when the first freeze came, her cabin stayed lit. Her windows glowed at night, pale orange like fire behind glass, and none of them could understand why, because no one ever saw her chop wood. Back before the freeze, folks still thought they had the high ground. They smirked about how she'd lose her roof to snow load, claimed her stones would crack come thaw, laughed when she started hauling barrels of sand into her cabin. Sand, when what she needed was food, they said. The irony stung by December, when the worst winter in 40 years rolled in. They called it the 79 howl. Wind shrieked for 6 straight days. Snow collapsed cabins like matchsticks. Firewood vanished in stacks. 2 babies froze in their sleep the first week. 1 woman lost her toes before Christmas. A preacher nearly burned his own pews just to keep his wife warm through the night. And Anya's chimney smoked the whole time. Her windows never darkened. Her cabin never iced over. No one could explain it. She never came out, never came begging. Never so much as showed her face at the well, though her buckets were always full. Some said she'd gone mad. Others said she'd made some deal with something from the mountains. By January, they weren't laughing anymore. They were knocking on her door. First it was Mr. Keller, whose wife had caught pneumonia. Then it was the widow Norris, who hadn't seen her cat in 4 days and thought she might be losing her mind. Then the children, pale-faced and shivering, standing by her porch just to catch the heat that bled from under the stone frame. No one had ever seen anything like it. Her cabin steamed, while theirs turned to tombs. But she didn't open the door. Not yet. The blizzard came in February, the one no one forgot. They say it sounded like thunder without pause. that it dropped 7 feet of snow in 3 days and made grown men cry when they realized their chimneys were buried and their firewood sodden, and their families too weak to dig out. 3 men died trying to reach the general store. One was found clutching a Bible frozen to his chest. The other 2 never surfaced. And Anya's cabin, still glowing, still warm. By then they knew something was different. Not magic, something older than that. The few who peered inside through cracks or crevices, eyes too scared to knock but too desperate to turn away, said they saw metal tubes along the walls, vents under the floor, a stove that didn't roar but hummed like a distant train beneath the earth. They said the floor itself glowed, like a hearth spread flat beneath her feet. Some called it foreign sorcery. Others remembered the word she'd used once, long before she stopped speaking to them altogether, and when someone asked what that stove was supposed to be, she'd said pech, a Russian word, they figured later, for a stove that warmed not just the room, but the walls, the beds, the very earth underfoot. Not an American potbelly, but something older, broader, something that radiated, held heat like a battery, used stone, not air. One of them said it was like she'd brought a piece of her homeland with her, not a woman building a cabin, but a woman digging her past into the soil, recreating it. And as the storm grew worse, they stopped mocking her. They started praying she'd open the door, because there were still 3 weeks left of winter, and most of them weren't going to make it. The snow buried roofs. The wind snapped doors open and froze them in place. Horses suffocated in their stalls. Men crawled on hands and knees across yards just to find firewood that no longer burned. Too wet, too frozen, too late. And in that silence, in that brittle, shivering silence that came after days of screaming winds and nights so cold the stars seemed to crack, the knocking began. On her door, on Anya's warm door. It started with the widows, then the children, then the old hunched men who'd once said her stove was cursed, and her mind foreign. No one laughed now. They barely spoke. They knocked with cracked knuckles and frozen fists. And Anya didn't open. Not yet. But they stayed. They built fires near her steps with what little they had. Tattered wool, fence posts, furniture legs. They slept in piles like animals. They scraped snow away from the edges of her cabin just to feel the warmth that leaked from the seams of her foundation. Some called it mercy, some called it survival, some called it theft. It didn't matter anymore. Anya stayed inside. They didn't know what she did in there. Some swore they saw her shape passing by the small square window, carrying a kettle, sometimes a bucket, sometimes a child's blanket. But she didn't answer the door. Not when the Reverend came with his hat in hand. Not when the storekeep sent a boy to offer sugar in trade for warmth. Not even when someone left a Bible on her porch in a blizzard. She stayed inside until the day the woodpile burned. It was late February. The storm had broken, but barely. The snow hadn't melted. It had simply stopped falling long enough for folks to bury their dead or pull their animals from where they'd frozen standing up. Wind still tore through the valley like a beast half-fed. That morning, Keller's boy, the oldest left in town, lit what little wood remained outside his family's dugout. His hands were shaking. His father hadn't spoken in a week. His sisters were down to rags, and what little warmth they had came from huddling near the frame of Anya's cabin. So he tried to make a fire. The spark caught, but the flames spread faster than he expected. The pile had been stacked too close to the siding. Makeshift timber, fences, dried roots, hay even, and the wind pulled the flame upward before he could shout. In seconds, fire licked at the frame of Anya's house. The crowd screamed. They tried to shovel snow onto it, throw blankets, even fling ice from their canteens. But it was too dry, too starved, too fast, until the door opened, and Anya stepped out, wearing nothing but a thick coat and a scarf drawn tight over her mouth. She grabbed a bucket from inside, not of water but sand, black, soot-covered sand, still warm. She threw it straight into the flames. It hissed, stifled, smothered. She did it again. 3 more buckets came, from where they didn't know. But within minutes, the fire was nothing but a steaming patch of blackened snow, melting fast against the edge of her rock floor. The crowd stood frozen, silent. She looked at them, not angry, not triumphant, just tired. And when the smallest girl, maybe 4, her cheeks bloodless, her lips cracked, reached out a hand and whispered, "Please," Anya nodded once and stepped aside. No words, just space. The door open, the warmth real. They came in quiet, not in a rush, not like thieves or beggars, but like men and women who knew their shame, who knew they'd mocked her, scorned her, called her stove foreign, her home foolish, her ways stupid. They carried their silence with them like frost on their boots. And Anya said nothing, just ladled soup from a pot already hot. Soup thick with barley, roots, something sweet and unfamiliar. No meat, but warm, filling. She didn't ask them to explain. She didn't ask them to stay, but they did. They slept on the floor, and it was warm. They touched the walls, and they were warm. One woman, old Mrs. Teager, wept. She hadn't felt heat in her bones since November. Her hands were red raw, the tips of 2 fingers gone from frostbite. She whispered a prayer in her corner. Didn't know who she was praying to anymore. Anya sat by the stove. She didn't feed it wood. She fed it bricks, coals, something packed in square cloth bundles. When the stove door opened, they saw a glow, unlike any flame. Steady, low, orange-red, like an ember banked beneath stone. It didn't roar, it pulsed, and they felt the heat even from across the room. The stove wasn't just heating the air, it was heating the cabin itself. The floor had been built atop a layer of stone and sand that retained warmth. And not just that, it radiated it. Even when the fire dimmed, the heat remained, like the walls themselves were alive with it. Someone muttered the word again, Pech. Not a stove, a system, a hearth under the world. For 2 days, no one left. They took turns sleeping, ate in silence, passed around blankets and played with the few toys the children had left. Someone mended a sock, someone else brushed hair, the kind of acts people forget matter until they are almost dead. On the 3rd day, the Reverend asked her, "Why this?" he said gently. "Why this stove?" Anya didn't answer at first, but she pointed to the corner, to a photograph. Old, cracked, a stone hut on a flat plain, snow higher than the roofline, smoke from a pipe that curved down, not up. "My father," she said finally, in her broken accent, "he built in Russia, for winter, longer than here." She tapped the stove. "This is his." The room fell quiet. They hadn't known, hadn't imagined. The stove wasn't just foreign, it was family. She hadn't brought over a machine, she'd brought history, survival carved in iron. The warmth held, even as the cold pressed on outside, even as other cabins collapsed. People came, not just from the valley, but from further out. Word spread that Anya's place was warm, that she had a foreign stove that could outlast firewood, outlast storms, outlast death. By early March, there were 17 people inside that one cabin, and no one shivered, no one froze, not once. The children drew on the walls with charcoal. The men carved small toys. The women stitched scraps into quilts. Laughter returned, brittle at first, then real, and Anya watched it all from beside the stove. Sometimes she smiled. Once, she sang. By mid-March, the thaw came, not slow, but sudden. The sun returned with violence, as if to scold the land for what it had endured. Ice cracked like rifle fire. Trees split, rivers swelled, the valley groaned back to life. And Anya's cabin stood, intact, warm, the first to survive the winter unbroken. The others, they dug out what was left, salvaged beams, buried their dead, mourned in quiet ways. And when they looked back toward the edge of the valley, toward the cabin with the bent chimney and the strange stones and the stove that still glowed faintly orange, they no longer called it foreign, they called it salvation. The snows melted unevenly that year. They left hard white slabs like broken teeth across the valley floor. Where once there were barns, now there were splinters. Chimneys stuck up from mounds like headstones. In one place, the remains of a sled were wedged into the branches of a pine 20 feet high, lifted by wind or desperation no one knew. The thaw revealed everything that had been hidden by storm, the half-dead, the fully dead, and the truth of who had prepared and who had gambled and lost. Anya's cabin didn't just survive, it became the last structure standing with its walls untouched, its roof unbowed, and its hearth still glowing. And that fact, simple as it was, humiliated the men more than any sermon ever had. The same men who'd laughed at her stone floor now ran their fingers over the heat-retaining bricks like they were sacred. They crouched low beside the vents under the walls, trying to feel how the warmth moved. Some took out notebooks, actual notebooks, and sketched the angle of the chimney, the curve of the stove door, the placement of the sand buckets and brick storage. But they never asked her directly, not one. Anya noticed, of course. They didn't speak to her, not unless they had to, not unless it was to thank her in private. With heads lowered, voices quiet, ashamed to meet her eye. They'd stayed in her cabin for weeks, slept on her floors, let their children draw in her books, and their wives use her wash basin. Some had eaten the last of her root cellar. Others had broken her tools in their eagerness to help and never repaired them. But none had the courage to ask her how the stove worked, how the heat held so long, how the cabin had stayed warm while theirs turned to frost graves. Instead, they built again, but now, each of them differently, copying her in bits and pieces. One man carved his stove wider, another stacked bricks beneath his floor. Someone tried hauling sand and iron plates into his walls, though he didn't know why. None of it worked quite the same, because none of them knew what she knew. None of them asked, and Anya didn't offer. Until the fire. Not at her cabin this time, but in town, the church. No one ever figured out how it started. Maybe a lantern, maybe a stove left burning too hot, too long, maybe one of the children, eager to feel real warmth again. But within minutes, the small wooden chapel, just recently dug out from under a month of snow, went up like dry pine. It could have taken the whole ridge with it, but it didn't, because Anya had been there, delivering seed potatoes. She saw the smoke first, and instead of running, she threw off her shawl and bolted to the well. Not for water, it was frozen near solid, but for the sand barrel the Reverend had kept for his walk path. Anya dug into it barehanded, threw handfuls of grit into the rising flames, screamed at the men to get shovels to dig trenches, to open up the windward side. They listened, not because she yelled louder, but because her voice cut like truth now, like she'd already faced the worst of winter and come out stronger. They saved the school next door, saved the parsonage. The chapel burned to its ribs, but no one died. And when the flames had settled, and the wind had stilled, and the crowd stood panting with smoke-black faces, it was the Reverend who stepped forward. "Miss Anya," he said softly, "we'd like to learn." There were no chairs in the schoolhouse yet, just crates and makeshift benches. They cleared a space at the front and set up her stove parts. Not the real one, which she wouldn't disassemble, but a replica she'd begun forging with Keller's boy in her shed. Made from scrap, hammered and shaped across weeks, it resembled the original in form if not in heart. She showed them the flue first, the way it twisted back before it vented, how it held the heat longer. She showed them the ducts in the floor, the way sand and brick could hold warmth for hours, sometimes days. She spoke slowly, carefully, often slipping back into Russian and then correcting herself. They listened. Some wrote notes, others simply stared, because it wasn't just a stove, it was a system, a philosophy. "Most stoves," she said, pressing a soot-covered finger to a diagram, "they make fire in metal, fast, hot, but short." She drew a second line beneath it. "This one, pech, is stone. Fire goes through stone. Slow. Heat stays. Air is calm. No wind. No flame up chimney. It lives here." She tapped her chest. "Her cabin. It lives in house." Spring came slow. Even in April, the wind carried sharp edges, but the ground softened. Plows returned, chickens too, seeds were passed out, tools repaired, roofs raised again, and this time they did things differently. No more thin-walled shacks, no more stoves with single pipes. People began laying stone beneath their floors. They sealed their walls with clay and wool. They asked Anya what kind of sand she used, where she placed her heat bricks, how wide the flue must be to turn warmth without losing draw. She didn't always answer in words, but she showed them, laid bricks beside them, walked the line of their new floors and knelt to feel the air draft, even when her knees cracked and her hands still bore the scars of last winter's labor. She never spoke of thanks. She didn't ask for payment. When they brought her bread, she took it. When they sent their children to help till her garden, she handed them spades without a smile, but she stayed and helped, even those who'd laughed hardest. By May, the valley looked different, not newer, wiser, cabins built into hill curves, firewood stacked under tarps now, windows smaller, doors better sealed, and across 12 homes, the same kind of stove, not exact copies but cousins, with winding flues, low bellies and stone-ringed floors. Some glowed orange at night, just like hers. And on the last Sunday of that May, the valley gathered not at the chapel, which was still only frame and ash, but at Anya's cabin. They didn't plan it, it just happened. Families wandered up the hill with baskets, bread, music. One of the children brought a violin which squeaked like a wounded cat, but no one minded. And Anya, she brought out a stool, sat near the door, watched as the people who once mocked her foreign ways danced near the same spot they'd tried to beg warmth from not 2 months before. She didn't dance, but she tapped her heel. When the Reverend approached, he smiled. "We owe you more than we know." She didn't answer, but she held out a cup, tea, or something thicker, sweet and bitter, and he drank and nodded. That summer, when the county inspector rode through to count the dead and list the damages, he stopped by her cabin and stared. He circled it 3 times, knocked on her door. She opened it eventually. "You're the one with a stove?" She didn't answer. He cleared his throat. "Well, folks down valley said it saved half the town. Still nothing." He tipped his hat. "We'd like to learn how to build 'em for the county." Anya blinked slowly, then stepped aside. The county man stayed 3 days. He took measurements, asked questions, not just about the stove, but about the way the walls were built, how the floor was layered, why the roof was lower than most. He paced off the shape of the chimney's bend, and even drew a diagram of the crawl space underneath where the sand and stone had been packed. He carried a black notebook and a steel square, and asked to borrow a length of twine, which Anya gave without speaking. But more surprising than the things he learned were the things he didn't understand, because every time he asked how it worked, really worked, Anya didn't answer in a way that satisfied him. The heat cycles underfloor, she'd say. The bricks remember, she'd offer. He wanted numbers, airflow equations, insulation ratings. Anya just tapped her chest again and repeated, "It must live in-house." He left confused, impressed, a little changed, and in his report, he wrote a single note: cabin with Russian stove system retained 65-70 degree internal temperature without fire for up to 36 hours post-blizzard. Recommend further study. But no one ever came to study it, because spring turned to summer and summer to fall, and before long, the stove was no longer a curiosity. It was just part of the valley, just another thing people accepted, like snow melt in May, or bear scat near the creek. Anya's stove had passed from ridicule to myth to fact, and yet they still didn't understand it, not really. The second winter arrived quiet. No storms, no blizzards, just cold, long, creeping cold that settled in like a second skin, soaking into bones and doors and the spaces between floorboards. It wasn't dramatic, just unrelenting, the kind of cold that broke a person over time, but not Anya's cabin. That year she took in no guests, not because she was angry, but because the others didn't need it. Every homestead now had some version of her design, some better, some worse, but all warmer than the old ways. The town even began building its new meeting hall with a foundation modeled after hers, sunken stone, with a flue that twisted 3 times before venting. Still, some things hadn't changed. Anya remained alone. She didn't attend Sunday meetings, didn't join in the harvest dances, didn't visit the store except for salt and matches. And while no one mocked her anymore, they kept their distance, not from hate, but from discomfort, because something about surviving while others froze made her feel different, untouchable. Like she was forged of the same iron as her stove. But all of that shifted in late December, when the child got sick. Her name was Grace, 7 years old, pale hair, always barefoot, always smiling. She was the preacher's niece, sent west after her parents drowned in the Missouri floods. She was one of the few children Anya had ever seemed to tolerate, once even letting her draw chalk hearts on the outer stones of the cabin. When the fever came, it came quick. One night she was at supper laughing. The next morning she couldn't breathe. No one knew what it was. Not influenza, not pneumonia. The doctor said her lungs were clear, but her body burned like coals. They packed her in snow. They fed her willow bark tea. Nothing worked, and on the 3rd day her lips turned blue. They knew she wouldn't last another night. And that's when the Reverend came knocking. He didn't plead, didn't cry, just stood on Anya's porch, hat in hand, and said the girl's name. "Grace, that's all." Anya looked past him, at the storm clouds, at the valley below, at the window where, years ago, people had pressed their faces to the glass and begged to come inside. Then she opened the door, not wide, but wide enough. He carried the girl in. She was unconscious, skin slick with sweat, hands clenched tight. She whimpered once, a tiny sound like a bird caught in snow. Anya didn't speak. She unwrapped the girl, laid her gently on the stone floor, pulled a wool blanket over her, and lifted a metal panel beneath the girl's spine. The warmth rose up through her, from the rock, from the stove, and the next morning she breathed easier. It took 5 days. Anya never left her side. She sponged her forehead, murmured words in Russian, poured hot broth over a spoon, and held it to her lips. Once she sang, a low, broken lullaby no one recognized, the kind of song sung more to the dead than the living. But Grace lived. By the end of the week, she was sitting up. 2 days later, she laughed again. By New Year's, she walked home. And the people of the valley, now older, quieter, more scarred, looked at Anya's cabin not just as a shelter, but as something deeper, something sacred. They asked her to teach again, not just the stove, but the why it worked, what it meant, and this time she agreed. She spoke in the new meeting hall, the one modeled after her cabin. She brought drawings, old ones, wrinkled paper from a leather folder no one had seen before, her father's sketches, diagrams written in Cyrillic. pages stained by coal and wax. "This stove," she said, "is not invention." She tapped her chest again. "It is memory." She explained the principle. Not heating air, but heating mass. Not building fast heat, but deep heat. Heat that stays in stone. Heat that lives under your feet, not above your head. "It makes warmth like sun," she said, from below, and they listened with reverence. Spring came again, and this time the thaw was welcome. Because no one had frozen, no one had died, not even the chickens. For the first time in living memory, the valley came through a winter without loss, and they owed it to the widow with the foreign stove. By the third year, the stove was no longer called foreign. It was just smart, just Anya's way. You couldn't walk the valley without hearing someone say it. "Put stone under the floor," like Anya did, or "twist the chimney, not straight up." That's how she got it to hold heat. Even newcomers heard her name before they ever met her. She was a landmark now, her story baked into every hearthstone, and every new foundation laid in that valley. Still, she remained a widow, alone. Her garden grew straighter than anyone's. Her fire never faltered. Children left her wildflowers in summer and bundles of kindling in fall, but she never remarried, never moved, never built anything else. Her cabin stood exactly as it had that first winter, like a stone carved into the hillside, until the boy came back, Keller's boy, Matthew, the same one who had started the fire outside her cabin that day so long ago. The one who'd helped forge the replica stove she used to teach. He came back from trade school in the East with calloused hands and bright ideas. But most of all, he came back with a plan. He wanted to build a furnace, a big one, not for a house, but for the town, a communal petch, scaled up, one that could heat the new school and the meeting hall and even melt snow off the main road. He had designs, blueprints. He wanted Anya to help. At first she said no, not in words, just silence. But he came back every day, sat outside her door, even when the wind came, left sketches by her steps, brought her Russian tea from the city, and finally, one cold October morning, she opened the door and handed him a single coal brick, not lit, just warm, from her own stove. That was her answer. They built it in pieces. Keller's boy led the crew, all local boys now, grown into men, tempered by winters and hard-earned lessons. Anya didn't do the lifting. Her back wouldn't allow it anymore, but she directed. She tapped elbows with her cane. She squinted and shook her head and made them tear down whole walls when the insulation wasn't tight or the slope too sharp. They grumbled, but they obeyed, because by now no one questioned her judgment. Not after the blizzard, not after the second winter, not after Grace. When the furnace was finished, it looked simple, a long, low tunnel of stone, with a fire chamber at one end and 3 venting ducts curving beneath the floor of the new town hall. No smoke showed, no flame could be seen, but when they lit it, just one coal brick, same as hers, the stone began to breathe heat, slow, sure, like sunrise over iron. That winter was mild, but people still visited the hall just to feel it, to warm their feet, to remember the cold that could have killed them all, if not for one stubborn woman and her foreign stove. They gave her a seat at every town meeting. She never spoke, but she never had to. She'd already spoken the loudest in the only language the valley respected, survival. When Anya passed, quiet in her sleep, with no fever and no pain, the stove never went out. The coals still glowed, the floor still held warmth. It was a week before anyone realized. Grace found her. She was sitting in her chair, scarf neatly folded, her hand resting on a worn page of her father's sketches. The valley buried her near her cabin. They didn't use a wooden cross. They carved a stone marker, placed it at the highest point above her hearth, and chiseled in a single line, "She brought the sun into winter." Years passed, children grew, stoves changed. But in that valley, even decades later, you could find homes with sunken floors, stone foundations, and strange sloping flues. Visitors called them odd, foreign, unusual. The locals had another word, warm. And if you looked close enough at those stoves, beneath the soot, under the stone, hidden in the flue curve, you might still see the initials carved by a rough hand, in a language half the town still didn't know. A.P. Anya Petrovna, the widow with the stove that remembered. They never called it a museum. It was too quiet for that, too lived in, too unchanged. Years after Anya passed, and the valley rebuilt, and modern stoves came, and the furnaces burned oil instead of coal, her cabin remained untouched, not because no one could think of what to do with it, but because no one dared. It was as if the logs and stones and stove itself held something more than heat, something the valley didn't want to disturb. They called it the Hearth House. They never put up signs, no ticket booth, no velvet ropes, just a guest book in the corner and a cracked wooden bench outside the front door where people would sit in silence and let the warmth of memory rise up from beneath the stone. People still visited, not in crowds, never that, but quietly, steadily, a family in spring, a schoolchild in winter, assigned to write a paper on local history. A tired couple from back east who said they read about a strange stove in an old farming manual from the 1930s and had to see it for themselves. Some brought questions, some brought firewood. None of them lit the stove. It remained cold, but only in the way a relic cools down, slowly, stubbornly. You could still kneel beside it, press your hand to the bricks under the hearth plate, and feel something in the stone that wasn't quite gone. Not warmth, memory. There was a time during the war years when the valley nearly lost that memory. Fuel was rationed, iron was stripped, railroads pulled up old tracks to melt down. A regional official sent notice to seize non-essential iron, including non-operational heating units, in rural districts. The letter came by post, addressed to the town clerk. It never reached the cabin, because the townsfolk burned the letter before the clerk could even fold it. And when the inspector came, a grey-jacketed man with a clipboard and a car that sputtered on corn liquor fumes, he was met not by Grace, nor Keller's boy, nor any of the elders. He was met by everyone, every family, every child who'd sat on that floor. They stood shoulder to shoulder in the snow. And when he asked which cabin held the iron stove, the boy nearest him simply said, "There's no iron here, just stone." And that was that. The inspector left. The stove stayed. Over time, the world changed faster than the town could keep up. Television came, then phones, then machines that made heat with buttons and wires and lights. New folks moved in, unaware of the blizzard stories, the deaths, the survival. They built square houses with tall windows and electric ranges. They used fiberglass insulation and thermostats and laughed, kindly usually, when old-timers still built flues with bends. But they noticed something. Their houses never felt quite as warm, not the way the old ones did, not the way Grace's felt, or the old meeting hall, or any of the cabins modeled after Anya's. And when they asked, when curiosity finally overcame the casual comforts of central heat, someone always pointed them to the ridge. "Go sit by the stove," they'd say. "Then come back and tell me how warm really feels." It became a rite of passage, for a time. When a child came of age, 13, 14, sometimes younger, they'd be sent up to the hearth house with a single bundle of dry wood and a letter. The wood was never burned. The letter never opened. The point wasn't the task, it was the silence. The time spent kneeling by the cold stove, running your fingers over the soot-smoothed iron, pressing your palm flat to the floor and realizing the house was still holding something. Something like breath, something like a lesson. Some came back crying, some came back quiet, but none came back the same. Grace died in her garden. She was kneeling, pulling weeds from between the same stones Anya had once laid by hand. She wore a shawl and thick boots, and had tied her grey braid in the same crown Anya used to wear. She was found by a boy delivering flour, lying between the rosemary and the sage, one hand resting on the soil, the other tucked beneath her cheek like she'd just laid down to nap. She was buried next to Anya, not above, not below, beside her. The town didn't ring bells, they didn't raise flags. They gathered, every single soul in the valley, and they stood around that cabin in a great circle. No one spoke for a long time. Then Keller's boy, now grey-bearded and stooped, took a small bundle from his coat. It was coal, from the last sack left in her store. He placed it in the stove and closed the door. Didn't light it, didn't need to. One summer, a group of architecture students came from the city. They'd heard of the stove, now sometimes called a passive masonry heater in books, and wanted to document it in its original form. They brought cameras and notepads and asked the townsfolk for blueprints, models, cross-sections. The town said, "You can go see it," but that was all. The students spent 2 days measuring, taking temperature readings, sketching. One even tried making a scale model, but when they asked how it really worked, why it retained heat so long, why it never cracked, why the air inside felt different, the answers they got were all the same. Because she knew how to build it. Because she didn't build it for now, she built it for then. Because it remembers? The students left confused, but respectful. They added the stove to some university journal. No one in town read it. In later years, when the world spun faster and faster, and the old ways thinned out, the stove remained. There were times when people forgot it for a while. A winter with no snow, a decade with too few children. Times when the hearth house sat untouched for months. But then, always, something would happen. A freeze would come. A pipe would burst in a modern home. A child would fall ill during a power outage, and the town would remember. They'd carry the sick, the cold, the frightened up the ridge, wrap them in wool, lay them on the stone floor, and for a few nights, they'd feel warmth that no electric heater had ever matched. Not in its strength, but in its depth. The stove didn't just heat air, it held hope. One girl, years after everyone who'd known Anya was gone, wrote a poem about it. She pinned it to the inside wall of the cabin. Visitors still read it there. It said, "This is where the snow was stopped, where fire laid low and lived long, where stone remembered, where silence warmed us, where the widow built a world beneath the wind and gave it to us all. The stove was never moved, not even when the town modernized, paved the main road, and added satellite dishes on roofs. Not even when a grant offered to relocate it to a proper museum. Not even when tourists came asking where the famous Russian heater was, thinking they'd take a picture and leave. They were told, it's not a heater, it's not a thing, it's a lesson. And if they still didn't understand, no one explained further. Because warmth isn't a thing you can explain. You sit with it. You feel it settle in your bones. You remember what it saves.